Many early church figures supported the doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary. In this discussion, I will only address those claims based on Scripture. Below are Bible verses that are claimed to be proof that Mary remained a virgin after giving birth to Jesus Christ, along with my rebuttals.
Matthew chapter 1, verse 25, but did not have sexual intercourse with her until Heos U, she gave birth to a son, and Joseph named him Jesus.
If we think about it rationally, this verse actually refutes the doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity. Mary's sexual abstinence lasted until the birth of her first child. However, because of the belief that Mary was a perpetual virgin, Matthew 1:25 must be interpreted as, however, he remained unmarried until she gave birth. After the child was born, Joseph named him Jesus.
K. Bayer explains that the Greek word Heos U, after a negative sequence, often has no implication whatsoever about what happens after the indicated time limit. And Raymond E. Brown also sees that the context tends towards the absence of future implications because Matthew only highlights with emphasis on Mary's virginity before the birth of Jesus.
Other texts, such as 2 Samuel 6:23, Genesis 8:7, and Deuteronomy 34:6, show similar uses of the word until. Carl Keating emphasizes that if the modern use of the word until is imposed on such verses, it will produce a variety of strange meanings.
Well, it's clear. Even if what K. Bayer, Raymond E. Brown, and Carl Keating said is true, that, after the negative word did not have sexual intercourse, the Greek word Heos U does not imply that after it had sexual intercourse, meaning the text, even so, he still did not have sexual relations as husband and wife in the Catholic Bible, is an interpretation that is an assumption.
Then, regarding the firstborn in Luke 2:7, this actually locks in that after that, Mary gave birth to another child.
Therefore, the Catholics put forward another assumption, namely that the term firstborn in the Jewish tradition and so on remains an assumption. And we don't want to drown and be enchanted by a sea of these assumptions. So let me continue.
2. John 19:26 and 27 ESV. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple he loved beside her, he said to his mother, "Mother, behold your son." Then he said to his disciples, "Behold your mother." And from that moment, the disciple welcomed him into his house.
Because after the death of Joseph and Jesus, there was no one else to care for Mary, so Mary had to be entrusted to the disciple John. This reasoning is actually an outrageous assumption. If Mary, the mother of Jesus, had been living with the Lord's brothers all this time, and Jesus had been away from her house for over 3 years, what was the urgency of giving her to John?
In my opinion, Mary was handed over to John because Mary had become a believer, while the Lord's brothers were not believers, even before they came from Nazareth to Capernaum to put Jesus in the stocks. In my opinion, Mary was handed over to John because Mary had become a believer, while the Lord's brothers were not believers, even before they came from Nazareth to Capernaum to put Jesus in the stocks.
It is true that the Lord's brothers joined Jesus' disciples on the day of Pentecost. Although all the believers were gathered at that time, this does not mean that all those present were believers. Let's say that there were 116 believers, all gathered on the day of Pentecost. That doesn't mean that all 120 people there were believers, right? 3. Luke 1, verse 34, NIV. Mary said to the angel, "How can this be, since I am a virgin?" By the late 4th century, Luke 1:34 began to be read as indicating a vow of perpetual virginity on Mary's part. These church fathers argued that Mary's confusion stemmed from her previous vow of virginity.
This too is an assumption. John Calvin called it wicked speculation. To any sane person, it is clearly impossible for an engaged person to be one who is vowed to remain a virgin. Mary was already engaged before she received the news of her pregnancy. 4. In the incident of Jesus being found in the temple, Luke 2:41-51, Keating writes that there is no indication that Jesus' brothers were present at the time. Instead, Mary and Joseph unhesitatingly hurried back to Jerusalem, which, he argues, they would have thought twice about doing if there were other children to care for as well. Moreover, this is too presumptive or speculative, even completely backwards in logic. In fact, if Jesus' younger brothers hadn't been walking with Joseph and Mary, they would have been more likely to realize that Jesus wasn't with them. Moreover, this is too presumptive or speculative, even completely backwards in logic. In fact, if Jesus' younger brothers hadn't been walking with Joseph and Mary, they would have been more likely to realize that Jesus wasn't with them.
In conclusion, there is no passage in Scripture that supports the doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity. The evidence presented by proponents of this doctrine is speculative.
Assumption 1. Mary was a perpetual virgin. Assumption 2. Since the phrase hios ou has no future implications, Joseph remained unmarried with her until she gave birth. Assumption 3. Since Mary was given to John, this means she had no more children after the deaths of Joseph and Jesus. Assumption 4. Mary took a vow of perpetual virginity. Assumption 5. Jesus had no siblings, allowing Mary and Joseph to quickly return to Jerusalem to look for Jesus.
The 5 assumptions above are considered to mutually prove each other. Besides the circular argument, there's a flawed perspective. Catholicism's assessment contradicts normal logic. This is actually the result of an addiction to the idol of Marian devotion.
Example. In Assumption 3, if Mary had been living with the Lord's brothers and then moved to John's house, it would be very normal to interpret that something was wrong with the Lord's brothers, so Mary was moved to John's house, who was not her relative.
The logically flawed person even interpreted that Maria had no more children to live with her.
In Assumption 5, Mary and Joseph didn't notice that Jesus wasn't in their group. This is perfectly normal because they were focused on Jesus' brothers, thus neglecting Jesus' presence. The logically flawed person interprets this as meaning that because Jesus' brothers weren't there, Mary and Joseph could hurry back to Jerusalem.